Continuing right along, we now move into long-term memory, and what we want to focus on is the encoding part. So how does information get encoded from short-term to long-term memory? Uh, we've talked several times about the issue of maintenance rehearsal, but maintenance rehearsal we usually think of as just maintaining the information in short-term memory. But the idea also is that through repetition, I can sort of deepen this memory trace and kind of make it permanent, right? So if you just repeat things to yourself long enough, for a sufficient number of times, you will eventually learn it. We do this a lot, right? We do this especially when we're studying for tests. That's kind of like how you study for tests a lot, right? Is you have a list of words, keywords, and you want to make sure that you memorize the definition of the keywords. And what do? Maybe you make flashcards. I don't know if anyone still does that anymore, but you can make flashcards, right? You get a little note card and you put the word on one side, you put the definition on another, and then you go through the list, you shuffle it, and you go through the list and you just test yourself, right? You see the word, you think to yourself, do I know the definition? Then you flip it over and look at it, right? And you just keep going through this over and over again. And this kind of repetition is rehearsal, right? And your hope is that you're making it a long-term memory because later when you go to take a test, that information is still there, right? And so once it's there, it's a long-term memory, and you can then access it, and you can take your test and get a good grade, right? A couple things we could ask about rehearsal, though. What's the most effective way? And so one way to do it is what I just described is you have all of the keywords that you're trying to remember in a big list in a big stack of flashcards, right? And you're just going to go through the whole list over and over and over again. This is called mass practice. Another way to do it, though, is to divide your stack of flashcards into 4 or 5 different smaller stacks and go through each one separately. So allocate some time to study stack number one and go through that over and over again for a while, and then take a break. And then after some time has gone by, go to stack number two and study that. And then again, take a break and then go to stack number three. This is called distributed practice, right? We're breaking it up. This is old research. This goes back to the 1890s and the origins of memory research with Ebbinghaus in Germany. I wonder if you can guess what he found is the most effective way. And the answer is distributed practice. This is why we oftentimes say that you should not try to cram for an exam because the literal definition of cramming is mass practice, right? You were trying to just study all night long, learn all of the material all at once. It's not going to work. Distributed practice means doing a little bit every day, studying every day and spreading it out. That's going to work, right? One of the things we know about mass practice is that sometimes it can be effective enough to last just long enough to go take a test. So if you are doing mass practice right up to the time it's time to take your test, that information is going to stay active long enough to be there for you to access during the test, but then you're likely to forget it. And if you've ever had the experience of taking a whole class and taking tests and passing the test, but then at the end of the semester you feel like you don't even remember anything at all that you learned, that could be why, right? Because you might have been doing too much mass practice. So distributed practice is better here. But I should emphasize it depends on what it is you're doing, because if you're trying to learn words like that, yeah, distributed is better. But curiously, if you're trying to learn skills, mass practice is better. So let's say you're learning sports, right? You play basketball, maybe, and you're going to shoot free throws. So if you're going to shoot free throws by shooting 100 practice free throws, do you want to do 10 and then take a break and then come back and do another 10 and then take a break and then come back and do another 10 and do that 10 times and you've done 100 practice shots? Or do you want to just do 100 practice shots all in a row? Well, it turns out that's better for that, right? So when it comes to these kind of more basic physical kinds of skills, mass practice is preferred. But for learning long lists of words, that's when we need to get into the issue of distributed practice. But separate from that, there's this other issue here, which is that relates to the effectiveness of it, right? But is it natural? And what I mean by that is that on a day-to-day basis, how much time do we really spend rehearsing information that we want to remember later. When we're studying for classes, we typically adopt that particular strategy because somehow or another we've learned that that's an appropriate strategy. But we remember events from our lives all the time without any attempt at rehearsal, right? Thinking about just going, let's imagine you go to the mall and you got a big mall, you got a great big parking lot, you're going to park on one side near a particular store. Uh, and then you go in and you go shopping, and then if you're in there for however many hours, and then you come out and you just go right to your car. And did you ever actually do anything explicitly to try to remember that? Were you repeating to yourself, I parked by this store, I parked by this store, I parked here, I parked here, I parked here, right? And just like repeating it until you have it down? No, we don't do that, right? Instead, we lock our car and start walking into the mall, and we're talking to whoever we're with, and we're thinking about where we want to go, and doing all these things, and then you don't even think about it, right? But you remember it anyway. So that's not rehearsal, but it's still memory, still very effective memory. So we want to understand, how does that work? So there's other ways we can possibly think about how memories are encoded besides just this mere repetition business. And one example is to first think about chunking. And you might have heard of this before. So a couple of different ways to think of chunking. Here I have a list of some letters, right? Now, can you memorize that list of letters? How many letters are there? One, four, 8, 12, 13 letters, I think there. So that should technically be beyond your 7 plus or minus 2 capacity, right? But probably you're going to be able to remember them. Why? Because you are seeing a pattern here. You're seeing multiple patterns. You're seeing familiarity. You're seeing meaningful groupings. And so when you see all of those meaningful groupings, you can say to yourself, okay, I just need to remember not 13 letters. I just need to remember CIA, FBI, IRS, NASA. There's only 4 things I have to remember, right? I don't have to remember the exact letters. I already know what CIA is or FBI is and NASA and so on and so forth, right? So there's only 4 things to remember here, not 13. And that's going to be a whole lot easier to remember. So this is chunking, right? We use our knowledge, pre-existing knowledge that's already engaged in long-term memory, and I can use that to help mentally organize the information in my short-term memory. That helps me reduce it down into these meaningful chunks. And when I'm able to do that, this reduces the total amount of load on my short-term memory system so that these 13 letters no longer occupy 13 individual spaces. It can be reduced down to just using 4 spaces in my limited 7 plus or minus 2 system here. Another example of this is the study done with chess players. So what they had people do is they had people try to learn and memorize the locations of chess pieces on a chessboard. Now the pieces were not in their starting locations. That's a little too easy, right? So what they have is they have a situation where it's like a game is happening midway through, right? So both players have pieces all over the board. So maybe some pieces have already been captured, so a few are missing, but we still have a lot of pieces on the board, right? A couple of dozen. So a little bit more than the average person can remember. So we have an expert chess player, right? Somebody who's like a master player. Maybe they have an ELO rating and so forth, right? So they really know their stuff. And when we take a novice person who kind of sort of knows about chess, but it's not really an expert at all, we're going to ask them both to do this task. And what we find is that the experts are a lot better than the novices are at remembering the locations of all of the pieces. So we can say, well, what's going on here? Is it because the experts just have a huge working memory, right? And they can just hold all that information, and maybe that's why they're experts. But no, it's not that. It's that when they look at the board, they're seeing patterns, right? They notice that maybe one of the players is using a particular strategy and the other player is using a defense against that strategy. So as soon as they're able to see those things, then they have a structure in place to kind of put it all there. And so they say, okay, I'm just going to chunk it all into saying that this person's doing that, and this other person's doing this other thing, and then they're 2 stages into it or whatever, and then you're going to be able to easily recreate the layout of that chessboard. One way to control for this is to do a variation where the pieces are just randomly placed on the board. Because if the pieces are randomly placed on the board, there are no more meaningful patterns, right? The players are not using strategies here because there's no game happening. It's just random placement. And when we do it this way, the experts are just as bad as the novices, right? They can't find a pattern, and they're limited to just pure memorization at that point. What's kind of interesting about this is that this represents a particular characteristic of human intelligence that's very different from the way computers store and work with information, right? If I asked a computer to do the task of storing information about the pieces, locations of pieces on a chessboard, it could do it very well, right? It can outperform humans in that regard because it can store a whole lot more than 7 ± 2 bits of information. But it does it in the exact same way every time, right? It follows a certain set of rules, right? So this example of the letters, right? If I asked a computer to memorize those things, it would not naturally chunk it into CIA and then FBI and then IRS and then to NASA. It would just store it as 13 letters without any understanding of the meaningful connections between those letters. So in that case, in a way, the human is somehow being quite a bit more economical with our memory resources than a computer would be. Another way to think about this is a weird example. It's not exactly a memory example, but maybe you can kind of see the connection. Imagine bagging groceries. So if you're bagging your groceries at the store, or maybe if that's been your job before, um, you learn some things about how to appropriately put things together in the bags so that you don't make one bag too heavy. You keep some of the cold things together, and so forth, right? And you don't want to put the bread on the bottom and have it get crushed and so forth. So these are learned structural rules, but every time a new person comes through, they have different groceries, so you can't apply a fixed set of rules every time. You have to be smart about it. Um, but the computer, on the other hand, doesn't do that. If a computer, let's say we managed to program some sort of robotic system to just bag groceries for us, and it was just programmed according to some sort of fixed algorithm that just said, put these kinds of things together, put these kinds of things together, it would have trouble adapting to the variations in grocery orders that come through, and it's going to do some weird stuff that's going to not be nearly as efficient or as effective or smart as how a good experienced bagger is going to be able to do it, right? So what we're seeing here is that even though computers can store a whole lot of information and they can store it and then access it quickly and accurately, and in that way they outperform people, um, people still are more economical and smarter in a way, right? And this would raise the idea that when a computer plays chess, for example, that what it's doing to play chess is not nearly the same kind of thing as what an actual computer, or sorry, a human grandmaster is doing, right? A human grandmaster is got strategies and plans and patterns and knowledge, whereas computers might do things like brute force algorithms. What that means is that you're simply just saying that, okay, if I can play this piece, then I can maybe sort through all of the possible outcomes and permutations of outcomes that would happen from making this play, and then I can pick the best play, right? And if I can simulate all those outcomes in advance, this is just a large computational problem, but it's not intelligence per se, right? It's just brute force working through what's the best statistically optimal move at this stage of the game, right? That's not the same kind of expert level functioning here. So in this way, this human ability to organize information based on knowledge, expertise, it's a key component of human intelligence, and it's what gives us the ability to do some very complex things and can improve human performance compared to computers in many ways. But it's worth pointing out that it is not always optimal. It can also lead to bias. It can lead to distortion. This is where the comment to schemas comes in. So I mentioned that before, or I didn't mention it, but it's a note in the middle of the slide here, schemas, right? So we can use a schema as a form of a knowledge structure, and it's these knowledge structures that help us create this kind of organization within our short-term memory system so we can keep everything organized well. Why is it bad? Let me jump ahead before I even get to the bottom of this slide here. Got a little note here on the old research here from Bartlett. And I misspelled his name. It's not Bartlett, it's Bartlett. Uh, so what Bartlett did, he wants to study the way in which people structure and organize information and therefore store the memories. And he understood that pre-existing knowledge would influence that. And this is what he refers to as a schema. So here we have Bartlett's definition of a schema. It refers to an active organization of past reactions or of past experiences, which must always be supposed to be operating in any well-adapted organic response. So I like the word organic here, suggesting a biological system here, but well adapted. So here again, we say that the acquisition of this kind of knowledge is what gives us the ability to adapt to varying and changing circumstances. Keep continuing here. That is, whenever there is any order or regularity of behavior, a particular response is possible only because it is related to other similar responses which have been serially organized, yet which operate not simply as individual members coming one after another, but as a unitary mass. So just a lot of knowledge, right, as a unitary mass that can help us adapt and learn new things by connecting it to old things. Determination by schemata is the most fundamental of all the ways in which we can be influenced by reactions and experiences which occurred sometime in the past. All incoming impulses of a certain kind or mode go together to build an active, organized setting. So what are we getting at here? Here's a way to think about schemas in a way that connects to what I said earlier about taking a class and then forgetting everything. So let's imagine you're taking your very first psychology course, introductory psych, general psych, and you do all these things and you study, you get a B, right? And I got a B in my first intro psych course, B minus maybe, I don't remember. And then you feel like you've forgotten everything at the end of the semester, right? But then you go take your second psychology course, right? Some other higher level course. And sometimes when you encounter some new information in that course, you think, I kind of think I remember hearing about this before. Or maybe you didn't. But what you start to notice is that it becomes a little bit easier to remember and understand the new ideas, even if you don't have a good, conscious, explicit recall of the things you learned in your intro psych course. Things are starting to make more sense. Is it because you got smarter? Well, yeah, kind of, but it's not because you're just overall smarter. It's because you actually have that knowledge already inside of you, and it's giving you a way to make sense of the new information. I like to think of it kind of like a closet, right? So let's imagine you have a closet and it's empty and you need to put things in your closet. You want to put clothes in your closet, perhaps, right? But if it's just empty and it's just bare walls, what can you do with your clothes except throw them on the floor? So you got a whole bunch of clothes and you're just going to throw them in a pile on the floor. So when the day comes that you want to wear a particular pair of pants, what do you got to do? You got to dig around in this pile of clothes. You don't know where it is. It's going to be hard to find it. It's going to, you're going to make a mess. It's going to take a long time. You might not even find him. You might just give up and choose a different pair of pants, right? But on the other hand, what if I buy some racks and some hangers and I start hanging my clothes and I buy some shelves and I start folding them and putting them neatly into shelves and cubbies and so forth. So now I have an organization system so that later when I come back and I want to find my favorite pair of pants, I know exactly where they are. I put them in the one specific location, right? And they're there for me to access and see when I want to. And this is what schematic knowledge is kind of like here, is that when you take your first psychology course, it's like you're throwing all of that knowledge in an empty closet, and it just starts to form piles of knowledge that all get lost and messed up. But once you start taking other higher level courses, you start organizing the knowledge, right? And you're starting to put things in places, and you're building an organization system here, right? And it's that kind of organization that then allows you to learn even more new things later on, and you just keep building up the structure and organization and complexity of your schema, and then you can be an expert in psychology after you do this enough times, right? So that's one way to think about how you learn and acquire this knowledge. But what did Bartlett do here with this War of the Ghost study? He wasn't really studying that stuff. He was trying to understand, as I mentioned before, how sometimes this kind of structure and organization of information can impair our ability to remember things and distort memories and cause bias and cause mistakes. So it's this story right here. So we call this the War of the Ghost Study because Bartlett presented his participants, who, by the way, were undergraduate students at a university in England. He presented them with this story that derives from a Native American tale. So, story is here. I'll try to read it real quick. One night, two young men from Egulac went down to the river to hunt seals, and while they were there, it became foggy and calm. Then they heard war cries, and they thought, maybe this is a war party. They escaped to the shore and hid behind a log. Now canoes came up, and they heard the noise of paddles and saw one canoe coming up to them. There were 5 men in the canoe, and they said, what do you think? We wish to take you along. We are going up the river to make war on the people. One of the young men said, I have no arrows. Arrows are in the canoe, they said. I will not go along. I might be killed. My relatives do not know where I have gone. But you, he said, turning to the other, may go with them. So one of the young men went, but the other returned home, and the warriors went on up the river to a town on the other side of Kalama. The people came down to the water, and they began to fight, and many were killed. But presently the young man heard one of the warriors say, quick, let us go home. That Indian has been hit. Now he thought, oh, they are ghosts. He did not feel sick, but they said he had been shot. So the canoes went back to Egulac, and the young man went ashore to his house and made a fire, and he told everybody and said, behold, I accompanied the ghosts, and we went to fight. Many of our fellows were killed, and many of those who attacked us were killed. They said I was hit, and I didn't feel sick. He told it all, and then he became quiet. When the sun rose, he fell down. Something black came out of his mouth. His face became contorted. The people jumped up and cried he was dead. Curious story. What Bartlett wanted to do here is he asked these students, as I described them, to read this story, but he wanted them to remember it. And then he would ask them to retell and recall the story, but at varying intervals, right? Sometimes it was immediately, sometimes it's like an hour later, a day later, a week later, a month later, even a year or two later. And what he found, here we see some examples here, that the retelling of the story changes in systematic ways, right? So here, a person has reproduced it, after a certain number of times, and they say that they were out fishing for seals in the Bay of Manpapan. These are details that were not in the original story at all. And then there's a mention of, I cannot come for I have an old mother at home who is dependent on me. That's a twist, right? In the original version, it was, I can't go because my family doesn't know where I am. But now we've invoked an old mother who is dependent. Why did we introduce that detail here? Is it possible that the participant whose data we have here is this? Did they have an old mother dependent on them? Did they kind of bring that own kind of personal knowledge into the story and interpret the story in those terms, in their own terms? Maybe. And then look at the last sentence transformed over time, right? So here the idea. Let's go back to the last sentence here. So it's not the last sentence so much as this last little paragraph. He told it all, and then he became quiet. When the sun rose, he fell down. Something black came out of his mouth. His face became contorted. The people jumped up and cried he was dead. Right? That component of the story. This is for one person who retold the story many times over several longer intervals. So they start with, when the sun rose, he fell down and he gave a cry, and as he opened his mouth, a black thing rushed from it. Fairly close retelling of the original line, right? The next retelling, when the sun again rose, he suddenly felt faint, and when he would have risen, he fell down, and a black thing rushed out of his mouth. Again, a pretty close retelling, but there is a slight distortion now because the idea of feeling faint, which is not really there, right? Again, suggests maybe a reinterpretation of trying to understand what was happening to this person at this point in the story. If we go down to the fourth option, he lived that night and the next day, but at sunset his soul fled black from his mouth. Now we have something completely new, the soul. Is that what the black thing is from the original story? It's not clear, but certainly from the perspective of the person retelling it at this point, that's how they interpreted it. And now because they have that interpretation, that becomes their version of the story. And then once we get a couple more variations down, the reference to something black completely disappears, right? He lived during the night and the next day, but died at sunset, and his soul passed from his mouth. No more, it's completely retold and totally modified. And in fact, if we keep going, it gets further simplified to simply just his spirit left the world. So all of those details eventually get distilled down into some essence that is highly influenced by that particular person's cultural views and interpretations of this story, and how they have reinterpreted it in their mind. So again, this we would say this is the kind of chunking of information, right? The story has become reduced into a smaller tale that is as much influenced by the actual content of the story as it is also by that person's schemas, past knowledge, influencing how they interpret and retell it. So I described this as a form of human intelligence that can improve our abilities and actually reduce our memory load and make memory encoding more effective. But it can also cause distortions here. So when we talked about the distortions that we don't want in sensory memory, well, maybe we do get distortions as we move things into long-term memory, and the use of schemas can possibly be one source of that. Let's talk about the levels of processing as another way to explain how we encode memories in long-term memory. This is the elaboration business. So let's jumping ahead here. So here is what we are doing in this task, right? So we have what's called a semantic task. So what we're going to do is we're going to show people words on a computer screen one at a time. And we ask them to say something about the word, right? So rate it as being pleasant or unpleasant, assuming it has some association to that, or maybe provide a definition or use the word in a sentence, right? But these are all semantic tasks, meaning you have to engage with the meaning of the word in some way. But in another variation of this experiment, we have people perform a non-semantic task where what's going to happen is you see the word on screen, but I just want you to state the middle letter of the word, right? So you just got to scan the letters and say it's an O or whatever it is, right? You don't have to think about the meaning. You're just picking out the middle letter. Or if you think of a rhyming word, again, you don't have to think too much about the meaning of the word to rhyme it. It's purely about the sound here. Now, the way this really works is that all of these words and tasks are all randomly ordered into a big long list. So let's say I have 100 words in a big long list, and I'm going to show you the word, and then I'm going to give you a task. And sometimes it'll be a semantic task, and sometimes it will be a non-semantic task. And you're going to go through all these 100 words, and you're going to perform sometimes the semantic task and sometimes the non. I never told you at the beginning of the experiment that I want you to remember these words. I just had you perform the task. But then, surprise pop quiz, at the end, I'm going to see how many words you can remember. But specifically, I'm going to try to find out which words you remember. And what we would expect here, and what Craik and Lockhart found, of course, is that when the word was followed by a semantic task, people were far more likely to remember it than when it was followed by a non-semantic task. So the argument here, this is why it's called elaboration, or levels of processing, is that when I'm engaging in the semantic task, I'm doing some kind of deeper processing of that word, getting deep and accessing the meaning. Whereas when I'm, describing the letters or sound of the word, I'm not really engaging deeply with it. It's much more of a superficial task. And so the idea is that the more we deeply engage with something, the more likely we are to remember it, which I think probably makes perfect sense, right? So that helps us then deal with the encoding process. Let's also talk about retrieval. So after information is encoded in long-term memory, we're going to want to later retrieve it. One of the things that we need to think about with retrieval is that we oftentimes, there's a common word, it's a reminder, right? So we need reminders. But these are often sometimes referred to as retrieval cues in cognitive psychology. So a retrieval cue, is a cue that activates that memory trace and then causes you to remember it. So sometimes cues can be contextual in nature. So we can have place-based cues, right? So what does that mean? Maybe what this means is that if you go someplace you haven't been, like let's say you go to your grandparents' house, but you haven't been there for a long time, You go back, and what happens is you start to remember things that you didn't remember, you weren't already thinking about, right? And so you start to think about things that you did in that place many years ago, right? These would be place dependent memories. What about state dependent memories? Is this a thing? Um, some people have tried to do this. I would say I have the simplified version of it here. We could dig into this in a little more detail, but the simple answer is that it doesn't work very well. But what they've tried to do in some of these experiments is they would, they use alcohol in some of these studies, right? They actually have people try to learn a list of words under the influence of alcohol. And then later, after they've sobered up, we want them to recall the words. And then they say, okay, well, they don't do so well. But what happens if we get them drunk again, right? So that they are in the same they're in the same drug-induced state during the recall period as they were during the study period. Do they get a little bit better? And the answer is a little bit, but it's nothing that's very compelling. So I wouldn't really buy into that too much. But certainly, the question it can be asked and answered there. Um, Now, what about mood dependent memory here? So here what we're going to do is we're going to try to induce a mood in our research subjects, right? So we're going to get them into a happy or sad mood. There are different ways to do this. You can have them read sad stories or happy stories or watch a sad video or something like that. And then they're going to, after they're in this a happy or sad mood, then they're going to read a story about characters, right? And in this story, these characters can either be happy characters or sad characters. And then we're going to wait a day and we're going to ask them to recall as much information about those characters as they can. And what we discover is that they're able to recall more information about what we would call the mood congruent character. So if the participant was induced into a happy mood, they remember more about the happy character. If they were induced into a sad mood, they remember more about the sad character. So the idea here is that being in that particular emotional state kind of influences um, our organization of information, right? And that might be a kind of schema influence there as well. And so they'd be more likely to be encoded and therefore easier to retrieve when we're in the same mood as well. So that's a variation I should have mentioned as well, is that we can also not just influence the mood at encoding, which is of course relevant to that, but also it's related to the retrieval process. If we induce them back into that mood at the retrieval stage, that's going to influence their recall as well. And if we put them into an incongruent mood during the retrieval stage, it has the expected negative effect on retrieval here. Related to all of this emotion connected memory are things like flashbulb memories. So the idea is that when some majorly significant event happens, we tend to be able to say things like, I can remember where I was and what I was doing. People of my age, for example, have a lot of flashbulb memories about the terrorist attacks on 9/11, right? Everyone that I know close to my age can say exactly where they were, what they were doing, what was going on when they got up on that morning, maybe, and discovered what was happening, turned on the television, perhaps. And so that becomes a flashbulb memory, right? Because that was a very powerful emotional moment, and it appeared to have been then strongly encoded, but so was every other bit of that context, right? Like I can remember being in my apartment where I was at the time, and all of that stuff that happened that day, right? So all of those different memories that normally would just be regular day-to-day kinds of things that you would usually forget about now become connected to that stronger memory trace. In the end of the previous notes, we also talked about the Yerkes-Dodson law. So this idea of a little bit of stress and arousal can also improve memory encoding. Yeah, of course, and retrieval as well. And also related to emotional aspects of memories here are traumatic events. So sometimes people, when they experience trauma, have flashbacks of those memories. And sometimes that happens in times where we don't want to even think about them. So we'll call those intrusive memories. So again, it suggests then that maybe they can sometimes be triggered by certain events, right? So when people talk about having triggers for their trauma, right, it's because of these mood congruent effects that a particular word or emotional state or whatever it might be can activate those memories, and then those memories come back without, without much of our control over that, right? So these are all variations of mood-dependent retrieval in that case. Okay. Now, to finish up here, we got a little bit to go to finish up the long-term memory section here. We're talking about retrieval, but we need to talk about retrieval failure because we want to understand forgetting, what causes us to not be able to retrieve. So what causes forgetting? And we might think decay could be something here, and we see that we can create, as we see on the right here, a decay curve for long-term memories. So, I give you something to remember, and then I want you to remember it 10 hours later, 20, 30, 40, 50 hours later, and your performance is going to decline pretty steadily. That would seem to suggest some type of time-related decay happening, right? But there's a couple of problems here, right? One is that we could easily go find some 80-year-old people and ask them to recall things from their childhood, and they can do this, right? It's not even surprising. I'm not that old, but I'm almost there. I'm 56, right? So I can remember my childhood as well. These memories are 50 years old, right? I can remember from when I was 6. So it's really kind of hard to think that long-term memories have some sort of expiration date on them if we can keep these memories around for our entire lifespan. But maybe there's something we need to think about here. And what we need to think about is related to the example I gave about maintenance rehearsal and short-term memory in the previous video about turning a light bulb on and energizing it, and then it starts to fade, but then I re-energize it. So what if the same thing happens, not just in short-term memory, but also in long-term memory? And what do I mean by that? Let's imagine a situation where I have a long-term memory of something that happened when I was 5 years old, and I'm 25 years old. So that memory is 20 years old by now. But I think about it. And the act of thinking about it kind of re-energizes it. So now that I have re-energized that memory, maybe then I go back to not thinking about it, and that energy associated with that memory trace is going to gradually start to fade and decay. But maybe after another 10 or 15 years go by, let's call it 15 years, I think about that again when I'm 40 years old. So I have re-energized the memory trace. And then I stop thinking about it, and it starts to gradually decay again. And then I think about it again. That's 65. And again, that gives it new re-energized, energy here. And so I have kept thinking about this memory every few years. Maybe my examples are a little bit broad there, 20 years differences, but maybe every 5 years or so, that memory randomly pops into my head, or I get some kind of retrieval cue reminder for that memory that reactivates it and therefore re-energizes it. And so it's because of these reminders and this continued access to that memory and retrieval of that memory that I have kind of kept it alive in a way, right? And prevented it from decaying down to nothing. And so it is potentially possible. We could imagine a situation where maybe I never get any more reminders. So I think about it when I'm age 25, but then by chance, nothing manages to ever activate that memory again, no more reminders. And so if I go 30 or 40 years and now let's say I'm 65, 40 years later, maybe it's gone now, right? I have not occasionally, energized it, so it's gone. Could be, right? That's a possibility. We simply just don't have enough good data on such kinds of phenomena. And as you can imagine, this is pretty difficult to study in terms of how that could work out. And what makes it even more challenging is what happens if somebody tries to give me a reminder. So let's say I've gone 40 years and I don't remember anymore this event that happened when I was 5. But let's now imagine that maybe there's somebody else, maybe it's your sibling, who also was present during whatever this event might be. Maybe it was a trip to the zoo and you saw I don't know, you saw your first zebra, whatever, right? But you don't remember this anymore. But your older brother or sister might have been there. So now you're 65 and your older brother or sister maybe is a few years older than you. And they say, hey, you remember going to the zoo when you were 5, seeing the zebra? And you're thinking, no. I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't remember that at all. And then they say, well, sure you do. You were blank. You were wearing blank. We went to this zoo. We were in this place. We were in this city. Uh, Mom was doing something this. Dad said this, right? They start giving you these little bits and pieces of their memory. Uh, and if they tell you enough of these things, then suddenly it might be like, whoa, wow, I remember this now. I totally forgot. It's been 40 years since the last time I even thought about that, and totally forgot, but you gave me enough reminders that I was able to find it and activate it, and now it's come back to me. So in that sense, it wasn't actually gone, right? It never actually got decayed. We just kind of lost it, right? And this idea of losing the memory, it's a little bit like that messy pile of clothes in the closet that I was talking about, right? Except our long-term memory closet is this giant warehouse of memories of things that have happened to us over the course of an entire life, and we don't have a really nice, clean, organized indexing system. It's just piles of stuff, and so we just need the right kind of cue and reminder to be able to sort through these piles of stuff sometimes, right? So that would suggest that decay is not really a thing, but maybe interference is, right? Interference is the fact that some memory gets lost under some pile of other memories, and those other memories are now blocking access to that. One example of this could be something like this is a really weird example, but if I could say, "What did you have for breakfast this morning?" You can remember that. But if I asked, "What did you have for breakfast exactly 18 days ago?" whatever date that might be by the time you're watching this, maybe you don't know unless you have the exact same thing. If you're a person of strict routine, all bets are off. But if you vary this up a little bit day to day, you're going to be like, well, I don't remember what exactly I had on that day. All right, I can barely remember that day or what anything that happened that day. I don't know. It was a Wednesday, okay, but I know what my schedule is on Wednesdays, but I don't remember the specifics of what I had for breakfast or lunch or what clothes I wore that day or anything, right? So, but I know what I wore today, and I know what I had for breakfast and lunch today, right? So, what we might say here is that those old memories could still be in there. Maybe if someone gave you some important reminders about something that they were also present for on that same day, uh, then maybe you'd be able to remember that, right? But in the absence of those reminders, you have all of these other previous days worth of experiences and breakfasts and so forth that are all kind of interfering with each other. So we can describe two forms here, proactive and retroactive. Proactive means that memory traces are working forward in time. So that means that old memories kind of prevent your ability to access new memories. Right? So their effects are working forward in time, old affecting the new. Retroactive is the opposite. Things are working backwards in time. So newer memories, like say what you had for breakfast today, might interfere with your ability to access the older memories, right? One example of this can also show up in things like your passwords that you have to memorize, right? So this totally annoying thing that we have to do by necessity is change our passwords on various things every 6 months or however long it is. So I form a password and I think to myself, okay, this is a good password. I get used to it. I use it. I use it. I use it. I use it. Maybe I don't to get a chance to save the password. Maybe I forget, and I don't worry about saving the password. And I just have to make sure I memorize it and use it every time I'm logging into whatever it is I'm logging into. And then a few months go by, and this site tells me it's time to change my password. So I come up with a new password. And then a couple of days goes by and I try to log in again. And what do? I log in with the old password and then it tells me that's wrong, right? And I'm like, oh, right. I changed my password a couple of days ago. What was that? And then suddenly I can't remember my new password because all I can remember is the old password. That's proactive interference, right? The old memory trace is still very strong and it has prevented me from accessing the more recent memory trace. So its effects are working forward in time. An example of retroactive interference can happen in a similar situation because maybe it's time that I set my password and it's telling me to reset my password. So I'm thinking about all of the different kinds of password choices I have, and I think of one, maybe it's somebody's name and your birthday and so forth, and whatever it might be. So I put that in, and then it tells me, oh, wait, you cannot reuse a password. I'm like, oh, I used this password already, right? What are my old passwords? I don't remember, right? I just remember the one that I was just using, but I can't remember any of the ones that I used before that. And so this is retroactive interference. Is the only password I can remember using on that site is the one that has just expired. I don't remember any of the ones I possibly used before. So I keep trying different options, and it keeps telling me, no, you can't reuse passwords. We told you, right? I'm like, I don't know what my previous passwords are. So that's retroactive interference. Okay, cue-dependent forgetting. This basically boils down to there being too many associations between memories. This, I think, again, connects to our example of trying to remember um, what you had for breakfast 18 days ago, because the idea is that the connections between various memories and various breakfasts are massive and highly variable. So being able to kind of trace through all of the days and all of the meals you have eaten to find that exact one thing when there's so many branches, so many paths to follow. I'm using this metaphor here that our memory is not just like a warehouse, but it's kind of like a forest, right? And the forest has trees, and the trees have things in them that store all of the memories. But how do I know to go down this path or that path? Some of the paths look the same, and I got to go down all of these different ones until I find the right tree with the right memories hanging from uh, memory. That metaphor is only going to go so far here, but the idea is that there are too many cues, and the cues are really ambiguous and vague, and so it's going to not really be helpful here to help narrow things down to find that one exact memory. Final point for this slide is just conscious forgetting, right? And a directed forgetting is what it's sometimes called, or conscious inhibition. So we ask people to study a long list of words, and one of the groups is interrupted halfway through, and we just tell them, forget the first half. Just forget it and keep going and study the second half. We're going to interrupt group two as well, but we're just going to give them the little confidence boost. Remember to memorize all the words, right? So both groups have been interrupted halfway through, but one was told to forget the first half. So even though they were trying to memorize it, right? So when they were going through the first half, they were really trying to learn those words. We just told them, forget it, right? And so when it comes time to test them at the end, we're going to ask them, do you remember any of the words from the first half? And they're going to say, no, you told me to forget it. So I did. I forgot them. So that's one way we can also forget from long-term memory, is just intentionally forget, right? And so that's just our last example here. I mentioned a couple times already distortions in memory. So we can get through this, and this will wrap up our chapter here. So false memory research, a lot of this comes from Elizabeth Loftus. I mentioned her before. But before we do that, I want to talk about Dease lists here. So let's look at an example. I'm going to go to this list of words here. So we can have a list of words, and I'm going to ask you to try to memorize this list. Typically, I would give you some predetermined period of time to study this list. And then even after you had that predetermined period of time for studying, I might then take it away and show you nothing at all, just so you can rehearse it, let that memory trace bake for a little while. But then what we're going to do is I'm going to take you to another list. And what you're going to do is you're simply going to just say yes or no to whether or not any of the words in this list were in the previous list. So you might look at car and say no, and then you might look at house and say no, and then you might look at bed and you're going to say yeah, right? Zebra, rest, ice, pillow. What about the word pillow? Was that in the original list? Think about that. It might feel that the answer is yes, right? I'm pretty sure the word pillow was there, but oh, nope, it's not there. But you see the trick here, right? All of these words have connections. They're all related to sleeping. And of course, so are pillows. So what's happening here is that when you see all of these words, I want to keep with this a metaphor of energizing memory traces, right? So I'm energizing the concept of bed in my mind, and I'm energizing the concept of rest and awake and tired and dream and so forth. But these words also share connections with themselves. So this energy spreads across these connections or networks. We call it a spreading activation model. And as part of this network of words that are all related to sleeping would include other words that are not in the list but are still relevant to sleeping, like a pillow. And so the pillow is now indirectly receiving some of this energization. And so it becomes active in your mind. So then later, when you see the word in this list, you're thinking to yourself, well, that feels familiar. Why does it feel familiar? Because it's been pre-activated, right? But you confuse that pre-activation with its actual presence in the list. So that would kind of suggest that we are not even able to discriminate this activation that comes directly because the word was present in the list versus the activation that comes indirectly because the word was only related to other items in the list. This is part of what is referred to on this slide as source misattribution. That refers to the idea that I have this information, but I don't know where the source came from. I don't know if it was because this information was in a list or whether it was just connected to something else. Let's talk about some of the Loftus research here. There's a lot of studies to talk about, but one of the ones I'll talk about is the imagination inflation, or famous Lost in the Mall study. So the way this works, person is given a survey, and the survey includes a lot of questions that are very mundane, asking if you've ever done this or that. Like, have you ever ridden a bus? Yeah, okay, yes. Have you ever been to New York City? Maybe some people say yes, some people say no. Have you ever been to the mall in when you were a child? Most people will probably say yes. Did you ever get lost in the mall? Right? So as a child, did you ever get lost in the mall and separated from your parents? A lot of people probably are going to say no to that question. Hopefully they say no to that question, right? Hopefully that's not happening too often. So the researchers go through the list and they find the people who said no to having ever been lost in the mall. And then they bring them in for a second follow-up kind of session where they ask them to imagine that they were lost in the mall. And they do this kind of detailed visualization exercise where you went to this mall, you were at this particular department store, and you decided to go run and hide in the rack of clothes. And then when you were in, you thought your mom would come looking for you right away, but then she didn't. And then by the time you left that rack of clothes to go back to where she was when you left, she's not there anymore. And then you run around the aisles looking and you can't find her. And then you got scared and you ended up going to find the security officer. You ended up at the security office and they had to page your mom over the intercom. And this went on and it was very embarrassing. You got in a lot of trouble. Whole big long story here, right? So we put them through that, and then we send them home, and then we bring them back again, and we give them another survey asking them questions like, did you ever ride a bus? Yes. Did you ever go to New York City? Yes. Did you ever get lost in the mall? Yes. Right. Now, importantly here, it's not as if a really large number of people changed their answer from no to yes here after they've gone through this visualization, but a non-zero number of people changed their answers. And that's the critical factor here, is the fact that in just at least in a few people, they changed their answers here from no to yes, just because they had been asked to engage in this imagination of exercise, of getting lost in the mall. This is, again, is an example of source misattribution because they have this detailed visualization in their mind. They can remember everything they were asked to imagine. But again, they're misattributing the source of it. Was it something that I imagined, or was it something that really happened to me? And in this very small number of people, they confuse it and then they think it becomes real. So even though it doesn't happen in a majority of cases, it still becomes a phenomenon that we might have to worry about, to think, how many of my memories are ones that are in fact real, or things that I might have just imagined? And that's of course the bigger, larger concern here. Last thing real quick here. One of the things that we want to think about is how much can we trust our own memories at this point, right? And how confident are we in our own abilities, and in our own ability to correctly remember things that have happened to us? And so when we judge our confidence levels, This is called metacognition, right? So cognition is all of the things we talk about in this class, like memory and perception and attention and so forth, and cognitive control. But metacognition is how much we know about those things as they happen inside of us. Like, how much do I really trust my own memory and my own knowledge and so forth? One great example of this is I've used the example of talking about of studying for classes, right? So when you're studying for a test, sometimes you get to this point where you're telling yourself, I think I'm done studying, right? I know this stuff. I've got it down. I'm done. So I'm ready to take the test, right? That's a metacognitive judgment, right? You are making a judgment about your own knowledge and claiming that you know it, right? Sometimes it's the other way where you go into a test thinking, oh, I'm in trouble. I just don't know this. I don't understand it. Again, that's also a metacognitive judgment about what you're making claims about what you know and what you don't know, right? What's also critical here is that we're not always correct. Sometimes I can go into a test feeling super confident and then I bomb it, right? And sometimes I can go into a test being totally not confident, but I do fine. So this we suggest here that metacognitive judgments, our ability to be confident and make statements about what we know and what we don't know, is separate from our metacognitive accuracy, right? Which is whether we are even correct here. So sometimes we are overconfident, sometimes we are underconfident, and sometimes we are appropriately confident. We can call this calibration, if you will, right? That maybe there are certain things that work here that can sometimes improve our metacognition, calibrating it based on reality. That if I take a test and I was overconfident and I do poorly, I might have to recalibrate my metacognition a little bit to make sure that I try a little harder next time and not overestimate my abilities here. So to understand how this all works, we have these metacognitive processes listed here. First is the metacognitive knowledge, which is your own knowledge of what's going on inside of your head, right? So your knowledge about your knowledge, that's the metacognitive knowledge. Then there's the metacognitive monitoring. So how does this change over time, right? So judgments of learning, that's part of what I was describing here, right? That if I'm studying for a test, I have a feeling that I'm progressing, right? That I'm moving along and that things are going okay, so that I'm making a judgment of learning at this point. And then when I'm done, I get to that point where I'm making a claim about knowing, right? Like I feel I know it. So it's a feeling of knowing, right? And then I can also just ask people to estimate their confidence levels, right? So I could, I do a survey before people take a test. How confident are you right now in your ability to answer the questions on this test? And people can give some kind of like a percentage number, 100% confident or 50% confident. You might notice sometimes, I don't know if you've had this experience, but a lot of the textbooks and college courses that have online homework platforms often have metacognitive components to them. So they will ask you a question like on a quiz, but as you answer the question, it's also asking you to rate your confidence. How certain are you that you got that question right or wrong? Because one of the things that they want to do in these kinds of homework platforms is they don't want to just assess what you know and what you don't know, but they also want to assess your metacognitive monitoring here, right? Are you overconfident? Are you underconfident? And that helps give some feedback, perhaps, to improve your metacognition. I would say the jury is still out on whether improving metacognition is going to have academic payoffs, but nevertheless, that's at least the guiding factor there between why those kinds of things are included in some of those homework platforms. And then last is metacognitive control. So the idea is like, go back to that judgment of learning. I might think to myself, okay, I'm studying, but I don't feel like I'm getting anywhere. I feel like I'm just treading water. I'm not learning this stuff. So what that might cause me to do is it might cause me to change how I'm studying, right? I'm like, this method isn't working, so I'm going to try something else, right? So that's metacognitive control. I'm changing how I do things because of my monitoring process is telling me this is not working. On the other hand, I might think I am learning, I am progressing, so I don't need to change. And that's also metacognitive control, to just tell yourself, keep doing what you're doing. It's working. Everything's fine, right? Again, metacognitive control is also something that may need to be calibrated a little bit. If your judgment of learning is wrong, then your metacognitive control judgments might also be a bit misguided as well. Right. Well, I think that we are at the last slide here. So We're going to wrap up this whole chapter now, and we will then move along to the next chapter, which also, by the way, deals a little bit more with memory, a little less detail as I recall, but that video will be for another time. Okay, till then.